This movie was produced by Netflix, as that company was trying to establish their own library of movies and shows. Back before the streaming wars, Netflix was afraid of losing access to the commercial material available that had helped them establish their business model, so they needed more high-quality content that they controlled. I kinda wish I had enjoyed this movie more. It has all the components in place. It's a fairly standard hero's journey, the acting is on point, all the story threads come together, the action is good, fights are well choreographed, and on and on. One of the things that this movie does that I normally enjoy is it explores what a modern world would look like if modern technology had grown up in a world with fantasy creatures and magic. Our point of view character is a human, presumably, so that we can relate to him better. I think this is the thing that I struggled with the most. We are obviously supposed to see the world through Officer Daryl Ward's eyes, but the movie opens with Officer Ward having a fight with his wife, something I get, over disposing of a fairy that's getting into the bird feeder, something I've personally never had to argue with my wife about. At first, I didn't understand why it was such a problem for the wife that Ward wanted to call a professional exterminator. Then, after Ward had dealt with the problem, I felt that trying to pass this off was meant to show how incompetent and cowardly Ward was. And then, through the rest of the movie, he is shown to be immensely capable, professional, and fearless. This might have been the problem I had with the movie. It struggled to find a way to show us magic and modernity consistently. There were definitely things I enjoyed about this movie, though. I don't want to imply that there weren't. One of the driving conflicts in the first half of the movie is the distrust that Ward has for his orc partner Jacoby after Wade is shot by an orc robber. Wade suspects that Jacoby let the shooter escape, but the reality of the situation turns out to be more complicated and nuanced. When Wade finally confronts Jacoby and gets the answers he's looking for, he tries to tell Jacoby that Jacoby should always trust his partner. Jacoby replies, "So I'm supposed to trust you even though you don't trust me?" Wade is forced to concede the point. There are several moments of true character growth like this that speak to me, even if there is something about the world building that leaves something to be desired. I think I would enjoy a sequel or another movie set in the same universe even more than the original, if the writers were able to learn from their mistakes here. Seeing how a world of magic would work in a world of modernity is a trope that I enjoy seeing played out. I've released 2 books of my own trilogy exploring that idea. A Forgotten Hero explores the questions of mixing modernity and magic from an entirely different angle, though. Instead of imagining our own world, but with a layer of magic that everyone has to adjust to, my version has our own world with a layer of magic that most people can't remember. In the second book in the trilogy, one of the main character's allies gains the ability to remember the magical world, and this proves important. Here, I will include this section so that you can get a sense of how it works. Lieutenant Carrier had a gold mine of material to start tracking Crimson now, but the only other person he could share it with was you. By human standards, a lot of it had been acquired illegally. The Enforcement Division generally keeps a tighter lock on elves than you humans are accustomed to. Then again, with the right training and practice, we can become quite the problem for each other. With bank accounts, addresses, known associates, and detailed descriptions of every encounter he had with anyone, including you, Lieutenant Carrier, and you spent every evening reading reports to each other and talking about alternatives. "Why hasn't he left the area?" you asked one night when you and Lieutenant Carrier were eating. "He's got something that ties him here. Some of these mention a sick kid. Maybe the kid isn't healthy enough to move. If that's the case, where is the kid?" you asked. Lieutenant Carrier started combining the files for ideas on where Crimson Sun could be. You read a few, trying to connect the dots. Nothing seemed to make sense to either of you. After a week, Lieutenant Carrier finally put his reading glasses away. "I normally would be a little more cautious, but I think we need to try visiting his magic store." "The magic store? Why?" you asked. Most of these hideouts are abandoned buildings and burnt-out houses. There's no running water. Yet he's showing up clean when he shows up in person. He has to be getting a shower somehow. And you think that a storefront at the mall will at least have running water. Exactly. You agreed, and that Saturday you went to the mall to check out the magic store with Lieutenant Carrier. It was closed up. Lieutenant Carrier tried to get the mall security to open the entrance, but you didn't have a warrant and they weren't going to help you break and enter. Lieutenant Carrier started making a regular routine to walk through the mall for the next couple of weeks. Your evening dinners moved to the food court at that mall, which wasn't within sight of the magic shop, but did give the two of you an excuse to walk past it a few times per day. Then one day in the mid-afternoon, Lieutenant Carrier saw Crimson opening the magic shop. It happened to be on Lieutenant Carrier's day off, so he wasn't in uniform. But he couldn't let this opportunity pass him by. Lieutenant Carrier approached him and put his hand on the elf's shoulder. "Crimson, I presume," he said. Crimson took a deep breath. "Are you from the enforcement division?" "I'm not," the police officer said. "I'm just a concerned citizen." Lieutenant Carrier didn't want to let on that he was human any sooner than he had to. Crimson chuckled. "Concerned citizen? Do you know how many concerned citizens I've killed? I'm not here to cause trouble," Lieutenant Carrier added quickly. "If it were that, I would have just called the enforcement division, and they would already be on their way." Crimson took that in. This had to be a tell for him. Our enforcement division isn't like your police force. There are a lot fewer elves than people, so keeping people on call to respond to calls is inefficient. Besides, human police respond to calls about elves. It's rather redundant to have two on-call police forces in every city. The enforcement division is more like a detective corps and licensing agency in one. You go there to register a wand or tell them that someone has an unregistered Z crystal or something. If they get enough complaints about a person, they'll send a team after them. You don't call them to come make normal arrests most of the time, though. But Crimson called Lieutenant Carrier's bluff. "Maybe you did call them. Maybe they're on the way. Should we wait for them inside the shop?" Lieutenant Carrier had read too many reports on what Crimson could do to fall for that. But before Lieutenant Carrier could really respond, Crimson had reached into his jacket and held his wand. He cast Force Bubble and Lieutenant Carrier went flying across the hall. Lieutenant Carrier stood up and started chasing Crimson. When Crimson threw a fireball at Lieutenant Carrier, he first tried to duck his head and push through it. After all, you had done that. But he quickly jumped aside with burns on his arms and face. Lieutenant Carrier didn't want to let Crimson out of his sight, because he was afraid to forget everything. He was hot on the heels of the fleeing elf, but it's not fair to pit an elf against a human in a foot race. After Lieutenant Carrier turned a corner and lost sight of him, he started looking around. He waited for that familiar feeling of blissful ignorance to sweep over him. After about 2 minutes it dawned on him he wasn't forgetting.